It is now my pleasure to welcome to the podium our former member Mike Flynn, the retired publisher of the Puget Sound Business Journal. He will introduce our distinguished guest and lead us in a discussion of elections and lessons learned and not learned.
Come on up. They're all going to come up and we'll take seats at the stools. I'll introduce them as we get in.
We don't do this in the evenings after wine, right? On these stools, we just do them at noon hour.
I was going to say, we got the stool. Where's the bar?
That's later, Dan, later.
President Nancy, Rotarians and guests, I know our special guests here are excited to be here for reflections on elections, but particularly the '68 campaign in which each of them had significant roles, or I should say significant roles resulted in that campaign. I'm incidentally performing this moderator role partly because Rotary's budget doesn't afford a high-priced talent, and also because as a young reporter I covered the '68 campaign and pieces in which both Dan and Jim were involved. In the spring I did a series of web columns with interviewing each of them, which kind of set the stage for this. Dan, then Washington's governor, was the keynote speaker at the 1968 Republican National Convention. Jim Whittaker had a key role in Senator Robert Kennedy's bright but tragically brief campaign in '68. And Bud Krogh, after sitting out the campaign while his boss, here in the Seattle office, while his boss engineered the election of Richard Nixon, became part of the White House inner sanctum and eventually had a role in Nixon's fall from grace. After some reflection on '68, we'll talk about presidential campaigns in general and themes that seem to emerge again and again, as we've talked about it prior to this. These three are too well known to insult them with long introductions so quickly. Dan Evans was the state's only three-term governor. Then he was a college president at Evergreen, and then he was United States Senator. Many would say he's perhaps the most noteworthy leader in Washington State as produced. Jim. Jim Whittaker was the first American to scale Everest, a feat that led to his meeting Robert Kennedy when he scaled Mount Kennedy with him in Canada. He became the senator's close friend and his comrade through the brief '68 campaign for president. He also led the 1990 Everest peace climb on the 20th anniversary of Earth Day. After Richard Nixon's election as president in '68, Bud Krogh became a key part of the White House team, got caught up in the scandal, and went to prison. Bud has sought over time to shoulder the blame personally, which is kind of bizarre, but incredible, for Nixon's fall, and he's since tried to keep the attitudes that led to the fall ever in the minds of top elected officials and those who work for them. Jim's book that tells it all is titled A Life on the Edge, Memoirs of Everest and Beyond, and some of you may be aware that his famous line is, if you're not living on the edge, you're taking up too much space. Bud's book is titled simply Integrity, and I recommend both of them to you. We all await the completion of Dan Evans' autobiography anxiously. Yeah. So I'd like to ask each of you to recall a bit about that political year, 1968, and its possible relevance to this election campaign, and how the stage was set for each of your roles. And we'll start with you, Dan.
Well, of course, I had the privilege of keynoting the 1968 Republican Convention. At that time, Richard Nixon had pretty much cinched the nomination against Nelson Rockefeller and Ronald Reagan. The next morning after the keynote, I had a press conference that came out for Nelson Rockefeller, which didn't do me any good with the Nixon people. But I'm glad I did, as it turned out. It was, I think, one of the prominent things about the Republican Party and convention of that year was it really was the beginning of what since has become the Southern strategy of the Republican Party. You'd think Ronald Reagan would be the real favorite among all the Southern Republicans of that era. But if you look back, Richard Nixon took almost every state in the South in the primaries and in the leading up to the convention, because he'd made a deal with Strom Thurmond and the Southerners that if he would appoint a vice president they could live with, that they would back him. So they picked Spiro Agnew.
Top choice.
Yeah.
Jim?
Yeah.
So, Jim enjoys an audience looking out of it.
So my association 68 was with Bobby Kennedy. Actually, I climbed Mount Kennedy with him. It was named after John F. Kennedy. To start with, I got a gold medal from him that was given to Perry and Lindbergh and so forth. And 5 months later, he was assassinated. They named the highest unclimbed mountain Mount Kennedy. I led Bobby up it, and he was the first man to stand on the summit of the peak named after his brother. Needless to say, we became close friends. So I was there in '68 when Bobby announced that he was going to run for the presidency of the United States. He had tossed this around for many months, and a lot of his friends and good political experts recommended that he not do this. And it was back and forth. Ethel said, "You've got to do it," and a few others, and he finally thought he couldn't let the war go on and let those other things happen that were happening, and decided to run. I came back from that announcement that he was going to run, the same room that President Kennedy had announced his candidacy in. I came back, and Brock Adams met me at the airport with a check and said, "Open up the campaign." So two blocks away, over here at Union, I opened up the Kennedy campaign. It was a mean-spirited campaign. I reflect on some of the things I could have done and didn't. I was honorary chairman in the state of Washington. Then they sent me down to Oregon. My obligation was all of the towns under 5,000 people. So I had to go into these granges and convince them that their guns were not going to be taken away. And it was a tough campaign. And I reflect on it. Two little more things. Bobby, I told him it was more dangerous than mountain climbing, what he was doing, because I'd been through the crowds in California. He said, "Yes, I know." Then in the Olympic Hotel here, we had a night meeting of all the delegates in the state, and I talked to Ethel and said, "Good going." He had just won the nomination, going down to announce it in the Ambassador Hotel. Ethel earlier, a couple of months, and said, "Jim, he's getting so many death threats. I'm really worried." And I think now, could I have helped? And maybe things would have been different. I don't know, but I think about that and regret not having left REI in good hands and gone down there and worked on that campaign. Thank you.
Bud, you weren't in the campaign, but you were an interested observer with your boss back basically running it before they brought you back to the White House after the election. What did you observe about that campaign?
Well, I'd just like to observe that if Dan had been a little more successful in supporting Nelson Rockefeller, my life would have been a whole lot different. So it's just, 1968 was an extremely difficult year. It started for me in Saigon, where I was doing some work with Professor Roy Prosterman on land reform, came back, watched television and saw the Tet Offensive occur at the end of January. I think it was in 2 months, President Johnson announces that he is not going to run again for the presidency. 2 assassinations followed. I think 5 days later, the assassination of Martin Luther King. 2 months later, Senator Kennedy. An extremely intense convention in Chicago. I think it's the end of August. The Republican convention was earlier in August. And it was one of those things that John Ehrlichman, who was my boss at the time, said, you know, going back to Washington is a little bit like running away with the circus. And a lot of us ended up in the transition headquarters at the end of November 1968, a very divided country. The election had been won on Tuesday by Richard Nixon. I think if the election had been held on Thursday, it would have been won by Hubert Humphrey. I mean, it was that close. And I think we're in a similar political environment this year. It's going to be shifting right up until the last 2 or 3 days. So what people do during campaigns is very important. I think what was set in motion at that point was a kind of politics that Richard Nixon, I think, specialized in. It was almost personal in some ways. He was able to formulate the Southern strategy. He had a concept about national security that led us into some major breakdowns in integrity in the White House. And I was part of one of those breakdowns in 1971, which we've written about. I think during 1968, a lot of people formulated this idea of we and them. I know in Nixon's White House staff, there were demonstrators outside all the time. Major demonstrations were occurring. And sometimes people would use terms like, well, they're the enemy, or they're the other side. Well, they were citizens who happened to disagree with us on policies. But I think that kind of animosity in a campaign unfortunately flourished during 1968 and carried forward into 1969 and 1970.
But wouldn't you agree that when we were watching from the state level, after the election and the beginning of the administration, that the Nixon White House produced probably the best, the most forward-looking domestic set of policies since World War II, and they simply got destroyed by Watergate.
Yeah, I think that one thing is missed, because it's the 700-pound gorilla is Watergate and what happened there. But Richard Nixon had one of the most far-reaching, effective domestic policies across the board: environment, education, foreign policy. He went to China, reached détente with the Soviet Union, an anti-ballistic missile treaty. So many things were accomplished in the 5 short years that he was there, unfortunately overpowered or really overshadowed by some of the decisions based upon personal attacks and hatreds, which really, I think, is what destroyed him.
Jim, could you share a bit what was going on in the country that allowed Bobby Kennedy to tap into a whole new group of people? What was the environment then that allowed Bobby Kennedy to make such a mark in that 81-day campaign? That interesting. I don't know how many of you have seen the Vanity Fair piece last spring, a poignant cover piece on him that was titled "The Last Good Campaign." Why was it the last good campaign?
Well, I don't know if I've used that term. I haven't. I think it was one of the most difficult campaigns. But the country was torn. There were fires in Washington D.C. There was all kinds of things going on, and the war was such an important factor. I think that people were so divided, and I think they want to change, like they might want now. Things needed to be different, and there were a lot of people protesting what had gone wrong, and so there were divisions and so forth. When I was a pallbearer for Bobby, buried him in Arlington. After that, I went to the convention and the voting and so forth, but I just lost the spirit to continue because we lost Bobby. But it seemed to me that it was still a very close run, and as stated here, that Humphrey was really going, and I stood up for him in the convention in Washington State, and he was really going with it. And actually, I must tell you that when Teddy Kennedy introduced me to Senator Humphrey back in Washington, D.C., Senator Humphrey gave Teddy a jab and said if he'd have worked harder for me, I'd have won the election. But I agree with Bud. It was a very close run.
Dan, earlier this year we visited about the idea of a series of presidential candidate debates without the media you referred to as Lincoln Douglas Light. It clearly isn't going to happen this year, but maybe you could talk about that a bit and lay the groundwork for some future logical period and maybe even state level.
You know, this is the 150th anniversary of the Lincoln Douglas debates, and I doubt if very many people even know how they were conducted or what happened. The two of them running for the Senate in Illinois agreed to a series of debates, one in each of the 7 congressional districts, and the debates were, the first debater had 1 hour, and the rebuttal was an hour and a half, and then the first speaker had a half hour to respond. So it's 3 hours, and put it in context. They drew from 15 to 20,000 people at each debate, no amplification of sound, and everybody was standing. That's why I call anything we do today Lincoln Douglas Light, because they were heroes, and they were great speakers, and they argued well. But now we get the press involved in between candidates, and I think it's a disaster. And I proposed earlier that we have 8 debates between Labor Day and the election, preferably on a Sunday evening, and let all the stations carry it. Start out, in the first place, have the 2 candidates agree on 8 subjects that they're willing to debate. And each one would have 5 minutes at the beginning with a statement by a moderator of the current facts relating to that particular subject. And from then on, the 2 candidates are on their own. Each would have about 12 to 15 minutes to state their own position on that particular issue. And from then on, it'd be the 2 of them, just debating with each other for the remainder of the hour, a moderator only stepping in to make sure that both of them had approximately equal time. Now, it's Lincoln Douglas Light when you reflect on how many hours Lincoln and Douglas debated, but in 8 days of that kind of debate, we would know more about the 2 candidates than we ever do through the series of debate formats we have now. And frankly, after 8 debates like that, I think I'd be pretty satisfied with whoever won, because it would be between 2 of what I think today are intelligent, caring, potentially very good presidents, and whoever carried the day as a result of those debates would be really qualified for office.
Well, that could work at the state level, couldn't it, though? It's not going to work at the national level this year.
Sure,
but,
sure it could.
Gubernatorial.
Sure it could.
Well, I remember Dan's campaigns. They were always at the highest level. They were issue-oriented. They weren't personal. They drew people to work indefatigably for him. I know my wife was out in West Seattle ringing doorbells, and she had been doing it for a few hours, and she went up to one door and rang the bell. A man answered, and she said, "My name is Suzanne, and I'm here governing for Doorbell Dan today." And said, "Young lady, you've been at this a long time today. I think it's time to take a rest." But there was so much passion, even then, dedicated to your campaign, Dan. It was because it was at such a high level. And unfortunately, when you think about an hour or an hour and a half of sound bites, which is probably the way they try to structure it, it would almost be unworkable.
Yep.
Dan, you had said the last time we talked, which I think is really true, is that the most difficult thing now is to try and determine where the truth is and who's telling it. And I think that you hit the nail on the head, because now there's so much scrabble and in fact lies that are being promulgated by press and TV and so forth, that it's almost impossible to determine what the truth really is.
I'd just like to comment on that, because both Dan and Jim, and at least in my personal experience, demanded the people that were working with them or for them tell truth to power. I mean, I know, Dan, when you were running the Northwest Park Planning Council, having sat before that group when you were chairman, if I didn't really be fully forthcoming and the rest, there would be a little nudge from you and from others that I had to be more thorough. And when Jim ran the Mount Everest Earth Day 20 International Peace Climb, it was the same thing, demanding from those of us in the organizing committee, think through the consequences of everything you're recommending. Telling truth to power is often not the norm.
You know, we often think that the campaigns today are as nasty and dirty and personal as they can get, but when John Quincy Adams ran against Andrew Jackson, the word then was that Andrew Jackson was born out of wedlock of a mulatto man, and that John Quincy Adams was the pimp for the Russian Tsar. Now, that's tough language.
That's Nixonian.
But you know, the difference between then and now is the speed of communications. And we have arrived at a point where I think the biggest difficulty we face in getting honest political debate is that those who produce the media are a whole lot more sophisticated than those of us who receive it. And until we rebalance that somehow, I think we're in for real problems, especially now when the internet has taken over and the blogs and the comments and everything has absolutely no, there's no sifting at all for the truth, and you just have to, you're on your own to believe what you want to believe.
Let's move off 68. Change is the promise in this campaign. So was it in 68 in many respects. Talk about the perennial role that idea of change plays in elections, and does it evidence some sort of permanent dissatisfaction on the part of the electorate that there's an appeal to that?
Well, that's what elections are all about, is change. About the only time you don't get a real desire for change is when somebody's running for re-election. And then change is not very good. Especially if you're the candidate that's running for re-election. But that's what elections are all about. It's to measure where we've been, where we're going, and where we're going almost always produces change. And so I think both candidates now are, that's their key word, is change, and they're accusing each other of not being for change, and the other guy is, but they're both right. Change will come, and significant change, regardless of who wins this presidential campaign.
Jim, you want to address that? Or do you have a thought?
There will be change. And who it come from, I'm not sure, but I think that I'd better not talk too much about where it's going to come from. I don't know who will make the change, but there will be change. We've gone through some terrible times, are going through them now. We've done preemptive strikes. I often think of the preemptive strike that the Japanese did to our country back in 1941. And, I think it's really wrong, and a lot of people do now believe that it's wrong to do a preemptive strike against a sovereign country. So anyway, there will be change, and frankly, I'm looking forward to it. Okay?
Bud, do you have any thought?
You know what? I go with Jim. There will be change, and there was massive change after Richard Nixon took office. I think it's not realized that when we took office on January 20th, 1969, there were 530,000 military personnel in Vietnam or working with Vietnam. 530,000. That's the first day. Now, he had a plan to end the war, which he said ending the war with honor over time. By the end of his presidency, we didn't have any. I mean, that's massive change that occurred in a relatively short period of time. But we went through some extremely challenging times that, unfortunately, some of the president's own worldview and the way he saw political enemies, he basically called some of them traitors, and that got us into deep trouble. The discourse became somewhat mean-spirited, too.
Security has become an important issue since 9/11. To some extent, haven't candidates frequently made that an issue over the years, certainly harkening back to the communist threat in the early 50s. Is there any difference now with that issue, or is it one that candidates can play to without beyond legitimacy? Just curious.
Well, security is going to be, it is a big issue, and it will continue to be a big issue. We may well be headed for, we're dangerously close to heading, I think, toward a second Cold War. Russians are reasserting themselves, and we're right on their border with people wanting to bring Georgia into NATO. That's kind of equivalent to the Soviets wanting to bring Cuba into their orbit, and it's dangerous. And I think we're in for a dangerous time in that respect. But I think most of all, what the biggest change, it seems to me, internationally that I would like to see is whoever is president set about restoring the credibility and the respect of the United States and the rest of the world.
Yes, absolutely. Amen. I mean, that's exactly what I think has to be done. And I think our leaders need to be able to take advice that sometimes is in conflict with maybe what that leader wants to hear. And those who are on White House staffs or in the cabinet have to have enough courage to be able to say things that President might not want to hear. I know just one quick story. Sometime when you're in the Oval Office, the temptation to want to please at all costs is very high. And we had a gentleman show up unexpectedly at the Northwest Gate one time and asked to see the president, dressed in a purple jumpsuit and a silk shirt with a gold medallion with EP on the bridge of his nose, and it was Elvis Presley. And I was asked to set up this meeting between the president and Elvis Presley, which I did. That's a rather remarkable thing, seeing these two gentlemen in the Oval Office, each looking at each other. They'd never seen anyone quite like the other. And while I was there, I didn't know exactly why Elvis wanted to come, but I think he was there wanting to help the country out and the rest. And then during the meeting, he turned to the president. He said, "Mr. President, can you get me a badge from the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs?" Well, the president looked at me and said, Bud, can we get him a badge? Now, there's a right answer to that question, and there's a wrong answer. The right answer is, Mr. President, I'd like to look into that and check it out, find out whether it's consistent with the law. That's the right answer. The wrong answer was, yes, sir, we can get him a badge. And so the president said, well, make sure he gets a badge. And Elvis was so overcome, he stepped forward and he grabs the president and he hugs him, which is unusual then. And so, but I was so eager to make the president feel good, make Elvis feel good, that I just came out with a quick answer. And so often in that place, I would make decisions, others would too, is what does the president sort of want here, rather than what does he need to know and understand about this issue so he can make an intelligent choice. And I think that's the kind of leadership you want, are people willing to listen to contrary advice. I think that will help restore credibility if we can do that.
Well, I'd like to second that. We need diplomacy, not just might. And we're getting less strong anyway every year. But we need to talk to our enemies. You know, the saying is, know your enemy. And so I think we need to talk to the people that are out there in the rest of the world and become friends with them. They'd have helped us a lot after 9/11 if we'd have encouraged that, and we didn't. So I think we've got to talk to people and negotiate and learn how we fit into the rest of the planet. Thank you.
Mike, let me just follow up just one comment of that. Some of you might remember July 15th, 1971. I mean, I know where I was because I was in San Clemente. But the president went up, the White House, not the president. Anyway, so the president went up to the NBC studios and he announced to the world that he had accepted Zhou Enlai's invitation to visit China. Now, that was just an astonishing statement for so many people around the world, but I think it ties in with what you're saying, Jim. He felt he had to open that dialogue. He had to be willing to go to China. And, of course, I think that changed the geopolitical map in the world by that decision.
Jim, before we go to questions from the audience, it'd be unfortunate if we missed the opportunity to discuss a little bit the 1990 Earth Day anniversary climb of Everest, which Bud went along on, and which Dan told me a while ago he kicks himself for not having gone on. How did that come about, and just a couple minutes of it?
That was a wild and crazy dream. They said the wild and crazy dream is the first step toward reality. And so Bud came to me with that wild and crazy dream to get our enemies up on the summit of Everest for a summit of summits. So we took Chinese, Soviets, and Americans together and stood on the top of Everest with our arms around each other, demonstrating what could be done through friendship and cooperation. And we had an extremely successful climb written up in the National Geographic as the most successful climb, actually in the Guinness Book of World Records, the most successful climb in Everest history. So we did it. We stood on top, Soviets, Chinese, and Americans. We talked to President Bush, the other Bush. We talked to Gorbachev. We talked to Li Ping, the Chinese man, and it was amazing what happened. In Soviet Union, I delivered my pitch to try and get people over. The Chinese had said, we haven't had Soviets in our country for 30 years. I said, I know, I'd like to bring them over. And they said, well, we don't want to invite them unless we're sure they'll come. Then I went to the Soviet Union, and this big old no-neck guy came up crying, and I asked the interpreter what he wanted. He said he wants you to know this is the most important thing you'll ever do in your life, that the Soviets do not want war. He wants you to know that he lost his father and 3 brothers in World War II, and the Soviets lost 20 million people. They do not want war. And so this thing just took off. And then the Soviets said, we don't want to come unless we're sure that the Chinese will have us. So you learn that you've got to save face, right, on all this thing. But they came over to Rainier. We taught them. We went up. We put the first Soviet woman on the summit. She said, I stand on the top of this world for all the women in the world. Let there be no borders. Let there be only peace and a safe and clean world for our children and their children and their children. And then Dan was up there. Bud was up there. Dan wanted to come. But here's Bud coming up with us mountain climbers. He's running up to 20,000. He brings his son. They went up to 23,000 feet like a sturdy athlete.
All I can say, that was a high point in my life. It's just, by a lot. And I would just want to say that climb would not have been successful without Jim's leadership. And I could say that because I was at base camp, and Jim had been up to advanced base camp, had come down with something in his leg. We weren't quite sure whether it was a clot. And he had to leave that base camp and go back to Bangkok. Now, that climb just stopped while he was gone, because Jim was our inspiration. He was the visionary. He was the one that knew how to bring everybody together. And when he came back, and I think you were gone about a week, then we had the talk with President Bush from base camp, and within a matter of 3 weeks, we put 20 people on the top and about 7 different assaults. Nobody got killed. We came back friends. And it's a testimonial to what leadership based on integrity can do.
Good.
And luck.
We're going to take 2 of the mics. We're going to now have some questions, and we're passing the microphones to our mic handler, so please wait until they are present. Questions?
Thank you all for being here. Sitting down below you, 4 distinguished gentlemen, I include you too, Mike. I don't know why it is, but I can't think of anything but Mount Rushmore.
You know, I think my special prosecutor would have been appalled at that notion.
I have a question for you, 3 of you, about public service. What I remember about 1968, it was a year when many of us young people coming out of college thought that public service was the highest calling. It was the era of the best and the brightest getting drawn into national and public service. And since Watergate, we seem to have lost that ethic, and we've lost also the valuing of people who dedicate themselves to government service. And I would appreciate your reflections on how we might motivate our next generation to think about service as a career.
Well, I still think public service is the highest calling. All we have to do is read history and go back to our beginnings. The Declaration of Independence wasn't just a jotting of words. Remember the last few words: we pledge our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. They really believed in public service, and I think we may be, on another, politics is cyclical, and I think we may be on the cusp of change with an enormous number of young people really interested in this election. Now, if they translate that into actually voting at the election, they could change things. And I would just hope that we work toward restoring that respect. It's tough. I get so furious at most radio talk show hosts because they constantly denigrate politics and politicians, and yet, honestly, everyone in this room is a politician, or should be, because my dictionary, at least, says the first definition of politics is the art and the science of government. And to be a politician is to be a practitioner of the art and the science of government, and we all better be politicians in the best sense, or we're in real trouble.
Yeah. I'd just like to follow up. I absolutely agree with Dan, and one of the tragedies for me was not being able to participate in public service after leaving Washington, D.C. There's no higher calling to get good people that can go into government and make a contribution. It's extremely important. The Dan Evans School of Public Affairs at the University of Washington is preparing young people for outstanding service. I've had the privilege of going out there and speaking several times, and I think it's a lot of Dan's basic ethics and ideas are going through that. And that's true in schools of public administration, law schools, all over the country. Gordon Strachan had it wrong, by the way, as a friend of mine, when he was asked, what would you tell young people about government? This is in one of the Watergate hearings. He said, I tell them to stay away. That's the wrong message. You want them to come, and you want them to be inspired and enthusiastic, and to be able to have some comfort that they can work with integrity. And that's finally after 30 years my son wrote the book.
One final thing is I agree totally that we have to get the youth of America involved. I'm proud to say my son, Joss, has worked with AmeriCorps, and the youth that I see are doing things to restore the planet, to help the habitat. Another son is working in Port Towns on a program, No Child Left Inside. And so they're doing things that are good, that are amazing. They're looking out. They want to do it. I look at some of the young people and I think, yeah, okay, we're going to be okay. We're going to make it. We got those guys out there.
Thank you, gentlemen. Jeff Borek. And corollary to the first question, there's been some criticism of the press, and certainly in many situations deservedly so. But there was a time when the media in general was also a higher calling, and in fact, it played a big part in correcting some of the problems associated with Watergate. What can we or what would you recommend could be done to help improve the situation with the media and ensure that that remains a healthy part of our society as well?
Well, it's tough because I said earlier I thought that those who produce information are a lot more sophisticated than those who receive it. So I think, number one, we all better pay attention, be skeptics if necessary, but understand what the circumstances are in the various ways we're getting information. I think right now we need really strong, tough, ethical reporters more than ever, because we're getting this wave of information on the internet that has no control, no filtering, no measure necessarily of truth. And so we're being fed a whole lot of information, and it's more difficult than ever to sort it out as to what's right and what's not. And I think that gets back to an important, strong, vital press being absolutely essential.
And I would agree with that, Dan. So often, it's, as you say, the pace is so quick. It's very hard to get an understanding of a story. I find I have to read a lot of different resources to feel like I'm getting a balanced picture. And it takes a lot of time to do that today that we didn't have to do 20 or 30 years ago. And having very good reporters who are honorable and honest is extremely important.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for all of your comments. Because two of the three of you spoke so eloquently about China, Jim talking about having actually negotiated the peace climb, and Bud talking about the invitation from Zhou Enlai for Nixon, because we're probably not going to hear a lot from the candidates about the relationship between the U.S. and China. I wanted to ask the two of you what your thoughts are on where that relationship should go, because it is such an integral part of what's going to be happening in this century. Thank you.
Well, I think that when Richard Nixon went to China, it was not just a quick spur-of-the-moment decision. He'd been thinking about it for years and years, had written about it, because he knew that you could not leave China outside the family of nations, as he said in one article, nursing its xenophobia. He had to bring them in. And I think he would have foreseen, basically, the rise of China over the last 40 years. It's been amazing. China is going to become an increasingly critical factor in the world. And I think maintaining a peaceful relationship with China is very, very important. I once read something about, well, we might have a military conflict with China. And one of the specialists that I was working with at the time says, no, China does not want to have a military confrontation with the United States. If they have military needs, they'll have some on their own, but they'll hire the United States to provide that for them, to protect the sea lanes. I mean, they'll outsource it, and that's the Seventh Fleet in some ways. So I think the relationship is going to endure. It's extremely important for the long term, I think, peace of our country and the world, and it's important for trade.
Gentlemen, it seems that ever-increasing amounts of money are required to run for office, and it seems that the majority of that money comes from either extreme and not from the populist middle. To what impact does the source of funding for running for office impact the candidates and the way they govern?
Well, you have to, I'm just thinking about that because, you know, the amounts of money now are staggering, but the numbers of contributors are also staggering. You know, the Obama campaign, for instance, has reached out and utilized the internet as a way to gain huge amounts of money from huge numbers of people. And that's exactly where we ought to be. Now, I wince sometimes when I see editorials and columnists talk about the evils of money for political campaigns. Well, guess who ends up with 90% of all that money? It's the media who runs the ads and does the campaigning. So there's a little bit of a conflict there, I think. But you still, at some levels, you know, get back to the legislative district levels and the places where really an awful lot of our governing occurs. We've been focused on the national level, but an awful lot of our governing and an awful lot of what we deal with day to day happens at city and county and state levels. And I've told an awful lot of campaigners when they come around to me and say, I want to run for the legislature, and I said, if you don't wear out 3 pairs of shoes, you won't win. And it's not all about money. It's about being in a district that is small enough so if you start early and work hard, you can meet almost everybody in that district personally. And that doesn't cost any money except for a pair of shoes. And I think that personal campaigning at all levels is still possible to sort of counteract the power of huge amounts of money.
Oh, just one last thing. I say greed is a terrible thing. Greed clouds the mind of a lot of people. So I'm encouraged, as Dan said, to see these small contributions coming in from across the country. They're $10 and $25 coming in once a month to the campaigns, and lots of young people that are taking their bank money, their piggy bank money, and contributing to the campaign. I remember what John Kennedy said, that that the politics is the most honorable profession. And I still believe that. We've got a lot of problems to clear up, but there's nothing more vital to this country than an outgoing administration that's got vision and the courage to follow it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mike, for bringing these distinguished Washingtonians to our podium. Aldous Huxley said that man does not learn very many lessons from history is the most important lesson in history. Thank you for making us aware and sharpening our insights. Thanks to all of our program participants today. Jan's welcome to Seattle. You have a great legacy to follow. Next week, September 24th, we are again at the Westin. You have another opportunity to have your picture taken. Our short program will be by Daniel Rabbi Wiener, who will be talking about Jewish holidays. Imagine for a moment talking about history. If you had been able in college to major in beer. Well, next week, Charles Bamford is our major speaker, and he is the University of California Davis Professor of Beer. In all honesty, I know, they missed it. They missed it. Just imagine what foreign policy and domestic policy could have been. Actually, Charles Bamford is the Anheuser-Busch Endowed Professorship of Malting and Brewing Science. Times have certainly changed. We'll see you next week at the Westin. We are adjourned.
Seattle Rotary Online is made possible in part by a grant from First Choice Health, working with the Washington Health Information Collaborative to use technology to bring better health care to patients throughout the Pacific Northwest. First Choice Health.